everyone. I love that everyone is so excited about history and presidents. This is amazing. I'm Ali Vitali. We have an amazing, wonderful panel of brilliant people here to talk to us about presidential legacies and the people who influence them as well. As I've been reading your books, you talk not just about the men at the center of it, but also the people who help influence them and get there. So we'll dig into all of that. As we're talking, think of questions. I'll leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end so that y'all can ask the questions that you want to ask too. And we can just dig right in since everyone's here's friends. So for me, I cover the first draft of history, right? I get to go on the campaign trail with these people. You guys get to dig in on the true legacy building. I wonder, we can start with Doug, if you can talk a little bit about how you bring the humanity to history, because as I've read your stuff, you're not just talking about the hard politics, you're talking about the ways that being a person has influenced the president as well. I mean, think of your favorite, the Roosevelts, how you bring the humanity to these people.
Well, that's a great question. Thank you, everybody. And this is a Tulane graduate here. Isn't that cool? Well, you know, as my colleagues know, you know, the fun part of a biography is often bringing the humanity. And who are these people that, in many ways, if we're a celebrity society, for better or for worse, presidents become a kind of mega celebrity. And there's a lot of misinformation about them that gets out there. There are a lot of people that have a mind about them because they're a Democrat or Republican, and they're, you know, getting a certain kind of press diet that tends to either be positive or critical. Our job is to humanize a figure. So you mentioned Roosevelt, and Jonathan has written so well on FDR, so I might as well grab Theodore Roosevelt since in case he goes that direction. But when I did my book on Theodore Roosevelt, I wanted to know every little oddball fact about him. And luckily, there's usually somebody that knows that. In my case, it was a man named John Gable who ran the Theodore Roosevelt Association. He knew what days Roosevelt ate strawberries. He knew what he did every Saturday between 3 and 4. I mean, it was nutty, but he wasn't a writer. He just knew everything about TR. So the little things started mattering. For example, with Theodore Roosevelt, personally, he had a form of depression. It's called manic depression. And I don't do psychobiography, but this is from this is from the head, Jameson of Johns Hopkins Psychiatry, who put him like the Tigger figure in Winnie the Pooh. And what it is when Theodore Roosevelt's brother committed suicide through drugs, alcohol, and the Roosevelt line is filled with depressions. And one way people cope with deep depression is you become, you have a form of it called exuberance. And exuberance was TR. If he came in here, what a bully day, beautiful in New Orleans, look at the crowd, hello everybody. And you start thinking that's just politics, but he did it every waking moment with no reflection backwards, only forward, we're gonna go, we're gonna do, you know, and this kind of way to kind of numb the pain. He lost his mother and his wife on the same Valentine's Day. Mother died of Bright's disease, and his wife Alice gave death during childbirth. So he wrote an X in his diary and said, "The light has gone out of the light has gone out of my life forever." Well, add to that exuberance. And incidentally, I asked the psychiatrist, the top people at Hopkins, what do you assign if you're going to get manic depression? It's the best kind to have exuberance because it tends to be a productive life, but heart disease, heart attack, early death. From burning your candle at both ends. He died at 60 years old, Theodore Roosevelt, even though he had such a full life. And I asked, what would you do in modern psychiatry today? And they said a lot of rest, like Florida, Caribbean, and Ambien every night. Honestly. Sleep. He couldn't sleep. He had insomnia. And he drank a gallon of coffee a day.
I feel he and I might have that in common.
Well, and no alcohol. He was never, I mean, he would do a ceremonial toast of sherry or a mint julep, but he wasn't a drinker at all. And so that was it, fueled on no sleep, restless behavior. And it explains why he wasn't an explorer a lot. He couldn't sit still. when he finally died, really caught malarial disease at the end. It was from going through the Amazon. He gone out disappeared for a year in Africa. It was just burning figure. So getting the details about him helps understand policy in some ways too. And it's marrying the two together that makes for a good book. And my book was called The Wilderness Warrior, Theodore Roosevelt and the Crusade for America.
Yeah, I love that, especially when I think about the way that I do my job. You learn very quickly as you're following these candidates, all right, Elizabeth Warren's not a morning person. We're not going to be doing morning events. Or, she doesn't drink coffee. Or, the things about Trump that help you figure out, like, who's up and who's down, and so what policy works. I think it's fascinating.
Klobuchar eats her salad with the brush.
Yeah, no. But I wonder, as we're talking about these presidents, you've written, both of you, of course, about Carter, but he's someone who we're talking about so much right now. And I wonder, Jonathan, as you parse through the Carter legacy specifically, and if you want to touch on Roosevelt too, you can, but as you parse through the Carter legacy specifically, it's fascinating to me the ways that sometimes your time in the White House can be overshadowed by the time that you've spent out of it, and how that manifests with Carter specifically.
Yeah, so just for clarity's sake, first of all, thanks to everybody for coming. Following John Meacham, that's like one time I was speaking and I followed Stephen Hawking. Anyway, so just for clarity, so Doug wrote a wonderful book in the 1990s, The Unfinished Journey of Presidency of Jimmy Carter, about his post-presidential years from 1981 to 1998.
Yeah.
And I wrote a soup to nuts biography that starts before he was born and goes, to 2020 when my book was first published. But in answer to your question, I was dealing with this implacable cliche about Jimmy Carter, lousy president, saintly former president. You go out anywhere on the street, ask somebody who doesn't even care about politics, and that's what they're going to tell you. The only problem with that is it's misleading and wrong in many of its particulars. And so one of the things, in addition to humanizing him and getting his love letters to Rosalind, which had never been not only published but never seen by anybody before, which are the steamiest ever exchanged between a future president and first lady. In addition to
it's a low bar, but yeah.
It's actually, it's not that low of a bar. I mean, you have like Abigail and John Adams. You got some things that Theodore Roosevelt wrote to Alice, right? So.
How could I forget?
Anyway, these were
Richard Nixon and Pat.
All right, point taken. But you'd be surprised. I won't spoil it for you if you're interested in the book. They're steamy, explicit. But in any event, in addition to
he's selling the Carters on sex. Right. This is new.
This is not the way I thought this panel was going to go.
That's a first.
So, well, they've been married for 77 years, so it had to be intra-marital relations, not extramarital relations, because those don't exist in the Carter story, which is probably one of the reasons why nobody had written a full biography of him before. Not very sexy that way. But so my goal was to humanize him, as Dub described, and he's a very, very complicated guy. I think of him as a driven engineer with a humanist struggling to get out. So he's a poet and a painter and a wood worker in addition to all the other things he does as a former president. He's a tremendously able, disciplined, and often very tough guy, contrary to people's impression of him. But I also, in addition to trying to tell his story in full, I wanted to correct this cliche. And that's not to say that Jimmy Carter belongs on Mount Rushmore, but I see him as a political and stylistic failure as president. He was crushed by Ronald Reagan in 1980, but a substantive and far-sighted success. So you mentioned the difference between the role of a journalist and a historian. Well, I'm both, right?
Yeah.
So I covered every campaign, mostly for Newsweek, going back to 1980. And one of the things I realized in doing this book is that the lens that we use as journalists is different from the lens that historians should use. So as a journalist, you mentioned up and down. Like I used to, in Newsweek, I used to do arrows up and down.
A lot of
like,
horse race, yeah.
We judge politicians by how they do politically. How popular are they? Are they making the right moves politically? Do you have a good fuzzy feeling when you watch them, like Ronald Reagan, who was obviously much more talented in that department than Jimmy Carter? But historians have to look at how they changed the country and the world. And when you look at Jimmy Carter in that way, and I won't get into all the substance, but whether it's not just the Camp David Accords, but the human rights policy that helped, by a lot of accounts of conservative historians, to end the Cold War and move a lot of countries to democracy, normalization of relations with China, foundation of our global economy, signed 15 major pieces of environmental legislation, which Doug knows a lot about, and had a much more substantive legislative record than anybody knows, in part because he had a Democratic Congress. He got more legislation through than either Barack Obama or Bill Clinton, and they had 8 years, not to mention the Republican presidents. So I think that his presidency is underrated. His former presidency is a tad overrated, because when you're not president anymore, you don't have any power, really. So he's helped eradicate guinea worm disease. He's supervised a lot of elections. He spends a year building houses with his wife. I built one with them in Memphis in 2016. And those are all really great, but it's extremely incomplete as an assessment of what this guy did. And he's a lot more complicated and interesting in his epic American life, starting in the Jim Crow South, than I think people recognize.
I just add one real quick thing, and then because I wrote what he's saying is exactly right. And the other example is, without doing the Panama Canal Treaty as president,
right,
he wouldn't have been invited as ex-president to monitor the election in 1989 when he denounced Daniel Noriega for running a fraudulent election. If he hadn't met Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas as president, he wouldn't have been trusted in Nicaragua in 1991 to tell them that Daniel Ortega, you've lost. Step down and bring democracy to Nicaragua. If he didn't denounce apartheid and be for human rights as president, he wouldn't have been able to have that reach around the world. And if he hadn't done the Camp David Accord, he wouldn't have been brought in to monitor other pieces. So it's a part and parcel, which his book does so brilliantly. It's much more than soups and nuts. It's the biography of Jimmy Carter, and it all connects into a really interesting American life.
I was just going to say, good for John, because we were talking last night. It took about 30 years for people to reassess Harry Truman's presidency and decide that it was actually a good presidency. Made hard decisions, was not very popular by the end, wasn't very popular throughout, but I think today we appreciate that tough, straight-talking guy from Independence, Missouri. Good for John, because John took on a president who was very unpopular. No one was really, what was shocking to me is that no one had actually written a biography of him. I mean, a proper biography of his life and presidency until John tackled it. And I think it's now starting a complete reassessment of his presidency, which I think, to all the points, the substantive points that John made, are really well-deserved.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I love this.
The role of a historian.
Now you got to pick a president.
Well, so I have a question for you too. It can be about presidents, but in your book specifically, you talk not just about presidents, but the people who unofficially influence them.
Right.
Those are the people who I think a lot of the journalists would be like, how do I make them my best friend? Because I want to understand what's happening in the inner orbit. But you write, and we were talking about this earlier, you give me an excuse now to hate Nathaniel Hawthorne even more than I did when I was in grade school. Because of the influence that he had on the president that he was very close to. So I don't know if you want to pick up there and then talk about this external orbit.
So I wrote a book, as opposed to my esteemed panelists, I've written one book on the presidency. So it's
Me too, don't worry,
on
it's
this
okay.
panel. And mine there's a new category for this. It's called President Adjacencies. So I didn't actually write about a single president. I wrote about 9 presidents and their best friend. And I woke up with this idea one morning in 2018, and I said, my God, there have been books about first wives, first sons, first chefs, first decorators, but nobody had actually looked at the role of the president's best friend and what it did to help shape the man's life and then his presidency, and in some cases, the world. So I picked nine presidents from Madison and Jefferson during the Revolutionary War up to Bill Clinton and Vernon Jordan, and I was actually able to witness that relationship, having worked for Bill Clinton. And I was just mesmerized by how this guy on the outside, who actually affirmatively told Bill Clinton, I can be more valuable to you as your first friend than I can as your attorney general. The reliance that the president had on this one man, not just for respite, and respite, Hillary Clinton said to me, respite is the single most important thing a president needs, and it's the single most important thing that a friend can provide. And that's what Vernon Jordan did. But it wasn't just respite. And what I found throughout the 9 stories I tell is that the first friend can also play a really meaningful role in policy and helping the president kind of think through issues and ask tough questions that staff just can't do. Because when you're staff, there's a limit to just how far you can go in pushing your boss without risking your job. And time again, you see throughout history where that staff member will wilt when he's choosing or she's choosing between my future in the West Wing, which is a pretty cushy job, versus standing firm for my principle. And what I found is that a first friend in history has actually played a really important role in providing both that respite and that substantive input. And one of my favorite stories is, well, I could give you 9 stories, but I'll give you one where, just to kind of accentuate this substantive point, there was a gentleman from Kansas City named Eddie Jacobson who met Harry Truman as a 16-year-old. He was making deposits in the bank where Harry Truman was a teller, and they formed a really great friendship as kids. It really deepened during the war when they served in the same field auxiliary unit. They started a haberdashery, a word I had never really thought about until I wrote this book. The haberdashery succeeded wildly till it failed wildly.
This jacket's not from there, right?
It could look like it does. But where it really kind of comes to its the climax is in 1948, Harry Truman has to make a really difficult decision about Palestine. And what do you do when the British leave that piece of land? Do you leave it to the UN, or do you let Jews who are trying to create a homeland there create a state of their own? And Truman did not want to deal with it. He was just flummoxed by the issue. His Secretary of State, George Marshall, absolutely did not want a Jewish state. He thought it would create a world war. He'd create an oil problem where prices would rise at the gas tank. He was dead set against it. But the Jews were pushing really hard for a homeland, and he said Jesus Christ couldn't make the Jews happy in his lifetime. How am I supposed to make them happy? So he just totally backed out of the issue. And, oh, thank you very much. So Eddie Jacobson, who was a Zionist, a Jew from Kansas City, never asked Harry Truman for a single thing in his life. He gets a call middle of the night saying, you need to go see your best friend because he's not going to see Chaim Weizmann. And if he doesn't see Chaim Weizmann, he's never going to declare an independent state if that's what ends up happening. So he flies across the country. He walks up the North Portico. He walks into the appointment secretary's office, and he says, I want to see Harry, because he knew Harry was going to be there. The appointment secretary says, you can talk to him about anything you want. Do not bring up the issue of Palestine. He says, absolutely not. Walks into the office, and I write about it extensively in my book, but he speaks to the president in a way that nobody else can. He knows him. He knows his history. He knows his pressure points. He knows who his idol is and how to play his idol to his benefit. And he gets Harry Truman, who had refused for at this point now, weeks about Chaim Weizmann, but for months about committing one way or the other to the issue, to see Chaim Weizmann, who comes down 3 days later from New York. They have a great meeting. And then 11 minutes after the State of Israel is declared in May, Harry Truman is the first foreign leader to recognize the State of Israel, which changes the course of history. I mean, we see it ever since 1948. It gave a legitimacy to the state. It created this really durable, hopefully it remains durable, alliance between these two countries. And it was only because of the intercession of a friend who could speak to the president in a way nobody else could that we had this monumental moment.
It's so fascinating. All of these books are really just wonderful. So I highly recommend all of them. I wonder if we can push the history to the present. So, Doug, specifically with your book, you talk about the catalyzing events on environmental changes and shifts through the lenses of Kennedy and Johnson, but you also focus on the activists who were pushing that movement. And I wonder if you look at what the movement around environmentalism looked like then versus now, where we are clearly in a climate crisis. That should be enough of a catalyst, you would think, but can you ever have a movement like the one that you write about again in this current moment?
Well, the book is called Silent Spring Revolution, and it's the third of looking at presidents. I wrote a book, The Wilderness Warrior, about looking at Theodore Roosevelt, which I call the first wave. It's conservation, but let's just, for shorthand's sake, use the word environment today. So the first one about Theodore Roosevelt and the environment, it was a progressive era in 1901 and 1909. U.S. Forest Service got created, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, et cetera. A massive period of change. The second wave I wrote about was FDR, when he came in with the New Deal, and Jonathan's written about this, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the planting of billions of trees. FDR instigated 800 state parks and endless stories with national parks and the like with FDR. And this was a big second wave. And when I say there are all sorts of figures around the presidents, Harold Ickes, particularly around FDR, and a woman named Rosalie Edge as an agitator outside the Beltway. But the third wave I just wrote about, there wasn't a Roosevelt. While Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon have a stellar environmental record, they weren't like the Roosevelts or Jimmy Carter in the sense that they had a deep connection to the outside world. Now, with that said, Kennedy had what we call blue mind. He was happiest in an Atlantic Ocean setting. Even in the Cuban Missile Crisis, he'll be doodling sailboats. And he, as president, he created the Cape Cod National Seashore in 1961 and Padre Island in 62 and Point Reyes. Those three of California's Marin, those are high real estate places to say. They're not remote land. This is right around urban areas. Those are the hardest to do. But what happened was, when I started writing the book about the presidents, they were moved by a real public movement, and it was born out of the anti-nuclear movement of SANE, with people like Norman Cousins, Coretta Scott King, and others, particularly Stop Nuclear Testing in Nevada. And that Barry Commoner was saying, we're all getting sick, children are getting sick, cancer spikes, leukemia clusters, on due to nuclear radiation from testing. From 1945 to 1992, the United States has detonated 1,054 nuclear weapons. Now, Kennedy, and I did the big one, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963 with the then Soviet Union and with Britain, which stopped the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere and underwater. So I look at it as an ecological event. But the other things were the anti-DDT movement and pesticides, which Rachel Carson was part of in the 50s. And then there was another lane called the Wilderness Lobby, which was starting to say we're building too many dams and we need roadless wilderness and we've got to stop thoroughfares. William O. Douglas, the great Supreme Court Justice, would walk 186 miles to stop the C&O Canal from being ruined from Georgetown to Cumberland, Maryland. So when Kennedy's president, he's inheriting these lanes. And Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon are forced by the public to become environmentalists or have an environmental side of their policy making. So much so that I could tell you, things that Kennedy did, and I have such limited time, but Lyndon Johnson started doing, Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, creating the National Trails Act, saving parks like North Cascades in Washington and Canyonlands in Utah. You got 2 for 1 with LBJ. Lady Bird was all about wildflowers, conservation, beautification, clean air acts, clean water acts, tackling smog. So by 1968, when Nixon's running for president, he's forced to hire John Ehrlichman, a land water lawyer from Seattle, most known for going to jail in Watergate. But he was really a top lawyer out of Seattle. And Nixon made a deal, said to Ehrlichman, you deal with the environmental stuff. I'll sign it as long as Ed Muskie of Maine has nothing to do with it. Nixon loathed Muskie, loathed him, and I don't have time why. But So Nixon, 8 days president, Santa Barbara oil spill. Just like here had Katrina. Event that shocks the region. And Nixon's guy, Walter Hickel, Interior Secretary, flies out there. And the first thing Nixon did, just like the East Palestine train, minimize it. Minimize it. And Hickel, former governor of Alaska, got on the ground in Santa Barbara, called the White House and said, do not minimize. It's ghastly.
So at least there's a parallel, right, between the way that we're seeing these things dealt with. I would also make your point, but if anyone has questions, you can start queuing up because we've got like 15 or so minutes. So if you want to ask something, Jonathan, and then we'll take
I'll just end that by just saying Nixon ended up creating the Clean Air Act of 1970. He was against the Clean Water Act, vetoed it, but he created the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And the Endangered Species Act got passed. You know what the vote was in the Senate? 92-0.
Unheard of.
So how today do you do that? You can't.
Yeah.
So the fourth wave, that was the third wave I read about. We're looking for the fourth wave.
Yeah.
It's got to be climate. It's got to be global. It's got to involve, and it may come out of states like California, Washington, Oregon. You're seeing this state game going on all the time now with DeSantis and Newsom and it might be these states are going to do this environmental thing and force companies to adhere. So we're in a whole new era, but we haven't hit the fourth wave yet. Jimmy Carter was one of the great environmental presidents too, but for a later date.
So just very, very quickly on the
quick point, and
environment.
then I have another question.
So when I was at the Carter Library in Atlanta, I found that in 1971, when he was governor, Carter was underlining articles in the scientific journal Nature about something that was called at that time in the science world carbon pollution, sometimes global warming. Other presidents would be out playing golf. Jimmy Carter's reading scientific journals. And then when he becomes president, and I think many of you know, he put solar panels on the roof of the White House, which Ronald Reagan then took down. He's always looking to the future. Always looking to the future. The first fuel economy standards, the first toxic waste cleanup. I won't go through the entire legislative program, but there's a tragic element to it, which is that he had this group in the White House, the Council of Environmental Quality, and they issued reports they called Global 2000 to look forward to the 21st century. And the first several reports were turned into legislation. The last report that they issued in early 1981, just before Carter left office, was on global warming. The recommendations that Carter would have put into legislation had he been reelected were exactly the same as the Paris Climate Accords of 2015. And so to me, would he have addressed global warming immediately? No, he wanted to move to electric cars by the mid-1980s. So there was a tragic arc to the follow-up on that. And just one other thing in terms of presentism or trying to sense how they're relevant. When I first decided to write this book was when Jimmy Carter was a guest at this book group that we hold at Gary's house, and I realized there's got to be something more to this guy than lousy president, great ex-president. But I didn't have a kind of an immediate present connection until 2015, later in the year, when I'm in the Carter Library, and I get texted, go to a studio in Atlanta and talk about Donald Trump, who's announcing his campaign today. He's coming down the escalator. And,
Who?
And I know we're not supposed to, he who shall not be named Voldemort or whatever, but anyway, so I did this, I go over, I do this thing, I realize immediately he's calling, Mexicans rapists and criminals, that this is going to be a big problem. But what I really remember is coming back to the Carter Library and turning the pages of these, thousands of documents that you have to look at when you're doing a book of this kind. And
Bob Caro disciple.
yeah, except Bob Caro, when they'd see me, he'd say, only one volume, about Carter. Sorry, Bob, my publisher is not going to do 6 volumes. And also, even Bob admits, you can't turn every page, but you're turning thousands of them. And I felt they were like a warm bath for me after Trump exposure. And for the next 5 years, anytime I felt overwhelmed by Trump, I could retreat to the un-Trump, a man of decency,
That's so interesting.
honesty, vision,
Yeah.
belief in the Constitution, love of nature, and I think that, you know, over time, and I think one of the reasons why there's been this enormous outpouring in the last couple of weeks, I've had calls from journalists all over the world, 4, 5, 6 calls a day from people wanting to talk about Jimmy Carter. Now, this was not true for a long, long time. Right? He was in very bad odor. Even in the Democratic Party, they didn't want him speaking at their conventions. Right? So all of this has changed. Why? I think part of the reason is he's just lived long enough for people to appreciate him, but part of the reason is the contrast to our political culture now could not be more stark.
Think about it. No president actually lived long enough to see their own presidency reimagined and redefined, right? I mean, Hoover never got. I mean, Hoover lived for a long time, but his presidency was a failure from the moment he left office to the moment he died. Is there a president who has enjoyed this moment?
Yeah, Bush 41.
Yeah, Bush 41.
So?
Bush 41 with John Meacham's
When
book.
Meacham's book came out and they turned, you know, because 41, it started doing what Jonathan did, the laundry
I
list
guess
of
that's
accomplishments. And when you're running foreign policy, you're Bush 41, and you have the breakup of the Soviet Union, German
big things,
reunification, the Iraq War that was successful, the apprehension of Noriega, you know, it goes on.
You know, just one thing on that point. So in 2000, let's see, it was 2008, and I went to Kennebunkport. I was still at Newsweek, and I saw former President Bush there, and we were chatting, and I said, you know, Barack Obama is saying nice things about your presidency. And this was when Obama was the presumptive Democratic nominee for president in the summer of 2008. And he said, well, I wish he'd say some nice things about my son. So it was really Obama who I think in many ways began that, because Obama felt that Bush 1 was a significant president.
And when Obama once showed up in Texas and landed at the airport to go to there was Obama was getting beat up by Fox News Hall, and there in the rain, he walked out the plane, and there was 41 right before his death in a wheelchair. Do you remember that? Saluting Barack Obama.
Yeah.
But the
Really
Bushes and the
moving.
Obamas, right? Especially as you get into more modern presidents, they'll probably get to see their legacies turned over and chewed over in ways that older presidents.
I mean, Obama's is kind of going in the wrong direction now for him. And I actually don't think that George W. Bush is going to get that
Fascinating.
resurrection. It's just not going to happen.
Question from the audience.
Sure. Is there such thing as the definitive biography of anybody, much less a president? And
No, absolutely not.
Two reasons. One, Gary, your comment about now we look at the friends and so on, but also our perception of what's good looks like and what bad looks like seems to change with each generation, and as a result, you look back and you come up with a different view. Yeah. Just any thoughts about that?
So there's no such thing as a definitive biography, and I actually state that explicitly in my foreword. I don't think it's possible, and I agree with a Dutch historian who said history is an argument without end.
Gary?
No, I'm just going to say that the beauty is that you're always unearthing new material, and the material dictates the narrative. And I think, even coming up with a new genre like the friendship, you can see a president in a completely different light through a different perspective.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So, Doug, I know you've written a book about President Ford, and I'm curious to know if there's been any reassessment of his presidency.
That's a great question.
Since then.
Yeah, Ford went up too. I mean, once he pardoned Nixon, many people were angry at him, but when they ended up honoring Ted Kennedy before he died, gave Gerald Ford the Profiles in Courage Award, saying Kennedy switched his song and said Ford did the right thing. David McCullough would try to elevate Gerald Ford as one of the great, great presidents. And so when Ford passed, it was a lot of admiration for him also. I would say a little bit, but not like Jimmy Carter, who's a global Nobel Prize winning person in a global way. And in fact, I think Carter's is going to be admired globally more than Ford or Bush 41. Now, two-term presidents, you got to grapple with that. That's a lot of time. They have a lot of power. So Bill Clinton may not rise in public estimate, but looking at the policies of his years will be a big deal. Richard Norton Smith is closest they're ever going to get to the word definitive will be his big biography of Ford coming out in like a month. And I would highly recommend it. I did a blurb for it, and it's a great book, and it's about 900 pages on Gerald Ford, and so that might be the one exception.
Or maybe
If 900
Robert
pages
Caro.
isn't
Maybe
definitive, I'm
Robert
not really
Caro.
sure that you can get there.
Yeah,
So we'll do 2 more audience questions with hopefully somewhat quick answers, and then I have a pet project question to finish us off. So go ahead.
Okay. I know you were saying about best friends. What about entertainers that have influenced the presidents?
Gary?
Well,
Like Will Rogers with Coolidge, and other entertainers that have, like Frank Sinatra with Kennedy. What about entertainers?
Not for the good.
Not for the
so
good.
this is a big thing with Carter. Some of you might have seen this film, Rock and Roll President, about his relationship with these rock musicians. He was elected with their help. Little known, they financed a lot these rock concerts where the proceeds went to the Carter campaign, helped him finance that miraculous 1976 campaign where he went from zero in the polls to the White House. And he knew Bob Dylan, who came and saw him. The one that he was the closest to was Greg Allman. And even when Greg Allman had drug problems, Carter never abandoned him, and he never ran for cover. And he also, I have a scene where he's down on his hands and knees working on the acoustics for Vladimir Horowitz's concert at the White House. Carter loves music, and he, one of his cabinet secretaries who'd been in the Nixon and Ford administrations, and Johnson, James Schlesinger, said that even though people thought that Kennedy was the most, cultured in terms of relations with entertainers, it was actually Carter who had the most entertainers to the White House. He had more in 4 years than the others did in 8.
And he had Willie Nelson,
Yeah,
too. But
Willie Nelson.
that Capricorn
He
Records...
smoked dope, not him. His son smoked dope with
we
Willie
think
Nelson
about-
on the roof of the White House.
If you think about America...
Clinton didn't
Sexy
inhale.
letters and smoking dope is not where I thought this
America-
was.
I'll say one thing
Oh,
though,
yeah,
that,
go ahead.
Gary.
presidents have used entertainers very effectively, particularly in campaigns, and I'm reminded of the role that popular culture played in the election of Bill Clinton. He was the first one to really appreciate that you could use people like Arsenio Hall and going on his show and playing the saxophone and really being able to become much more accessible to a much wider range of voter by using those kinds of forms. And I think that in the modern era of the presidency, there's been such a convergence of popular culture and electioneering and even governing that we're seeing that there's that intersection is a very helpful tool for presidents and candidates today.
And,
Thank you
and
for
Ronald
that.
Reagan,
Thank you for the
Ronald Reagan
question.
was all about it, right?
Right,
Nancy, right?
Yeah,
They had every
sure.
star and their
Right.
man coming in as advice.
Right, but in terms of a personal relationship, I actually think it's Eisenhower with Freeman Godson, who he was Amos or Andy, I can't remember which. But, it doesn't look so good right now, but he was actually a close personal
And they're
friend.
doing a
Yeah.
documentary
Dwight
of
Eisenhower.
Kennedy and Sinatra right now for the anniversary of Kennedy's death.
Thank you. Last audience question, and then we'll do rapid fire for the last one.
So, Gary, I love this story and the relationship with Eddie Jacobson. What of the 9 presidents who you covered, who had the most unusual friendship?
Huh. No one's asked me the most unusual. I think the one that seemed the least likely was Abraham Lincoln's friendship with Joshua Speed. Joshua Speed was the largest slave owner in Kentucky, and obviously Abraham Lincoln becomes the great abolitionist. They lived together in a single bed for 4 years, slept in that same bed together. I don't believe it was a sexual relationship, became absolutely best friends. for 4 years, Joshua Speed saves Abraham Lincoln's life by taking away all of his sharp objects when he goes through a terrible depression. But where it becomes so unusual and unlikely is that when Lincoln is elected president, they really haven't spoken very much other than argue about the issue of slavery through a series of correspondence. But Lincoln says, Speed, I want you in my cabinet. And Speed says, I'm just too rich to join it, but I'm going to do something better. I'm going to help save Kentucky from seceding. 7 states had already seceded by November of 1860. There's 4 border states that are thinking about it. And Joshua Speed says, even though I'm the largest slave owner, I'm going to go back to Kentucky and make sure that you message the war properly so that the state stays in the Union. I'm going to make sure that arms get to Union militants so that we can keep the state strong against any of the secession forces. He does exactly that. He becomes Lincoln's most important advisor in thinking through the Emancipation Proclamation, beginning of 1863, and ends up as a really crucial voice for Lincoln, despite the fact that they had such different views about the role of slavery in America and the constitutionality of it, et cetera. And it played a really important role in keeping the Union preserved.
It's a great question. And in the minute that we have left, I wrote a book about the thing that you guys don't have the chance to write about yet, which is why we haven't had a female president yet. Do you think, and we can just do rapid fire down the line, do you think we're going to see that soon?
Yes, there's a great book on Edith Wilson that comes out, and maybe she really was president.
Was my book wrong? Is that what you're saying?
But I would take a look at that biography of Edith Wilson if you guys. It's really good. Just came out. We definitely will have a woman president. I just have to believe it. Came a hair's breadth with Hillary Clinton. We have a vice president, Kamala Harris, who's a heartbeat away from the presidency, and it will happen. And my wife, Annan, who's here, we have 2 girls, and we all are about, let's get the first woman president in. There's no way they can do worse than the guys have done of the last 40 years.
I would agree, honestly. I mean, in the 10 seconds that we have, I really want to say thank you to this brilliant panel. We packed in so much history, so much fun. Please, round of applause. Thank you all so much for coming.